SpaceX is starting a brand new Starship tower while work continues on the launch mount, flame trench and tank farm infrastructure at 39A. Plus, there's been a load of work on the Giga Bay. Blue Origin continues testing for New Glen's second flight, and everybody, literally everybody, is working on launch pad construction. We'll have all of that and so much more coming up in this Space Coast Flyover. As usual, it won't be just me in this episode. I'll be joined by Adrian to bring you the latest from the Florida Space Coast. Let's start off with SpaceX's Roberts Road operations area, where SpaceX has made quite a lot of changes since our last flight just a month ago. For starters, there's now Starship tower construction underway. That's right, in this latest flyover, our Florida team spotted a brand new Starship tower section being built at the site. This section in particular is the module that sits right on top of the concrete base of the tower. This section is often known as Module 1, and for the towers we've seen so far, they've all had 9 modules in total. It's quite funny though that the steel legs of the tower section assembly jigs where this module is being built have been reused from when SpaceX built the modules for the second tower at Starbase, and yet they didn't bother to change the module labels on them. We can see one of them says Module 6 while the other says Module 2. Meanwhile, the actual steel legs that were used for Module 1 of Starbase's second tower are sitting just a few meters away, feeling ashamed and forgotten. As you might have also noticed in some of these shots, SpaceX has also started putting together the steel assembly jig legs for another tower section to be built, and there are 2 sets of 4 tower columns staged next to it. So not only are they about to start putting together a second tower section, but they also have the hardware for a third one already prepared. As we discussed in last month's Space Coast update, it's not a surprise to see SpaceX building a new Starship tower, since they plan on building potentially 5 more just at the Space Coast alone in the coming years, consisting of 2 launch towers and up to 2 catch towers at Space Launch Complex 37, plus the proposed catch tower at Launch Complex 39A. I guess the question isn't why they're building a new tower, but rather what this tower will be used for. Is it one of the launch towers for Slick 37? Maybe it's 39A's catch tower. Maybe they're going to start with one of the catch towers at 37. Right now, it's hard to say for sure because there's no indication one way or the other, but we'll keep a close eye on all of this hardware to see when we can definitively say whether it's one or the other. But what do you think? Is it for 39A? Is it for Slick 37? Let us know in the comments. On top of this tower construction, our team also spotted hardware for a new set of chopsticks staged next to the tent where SpaceX has been constructing the new Starship launch mount for 39A. Along with the chopstick hardware, there are also parts for a new carriage system that the new set of chopsticks will be mounted to. As it stands, the hardware for these look to be pretty much the same design as the chopsticks being used at LC-39A and also the set for the second launch tower at Starbase. It's interesting that these chopstick and carriage system elements have been staged next to the tent because they used to be built to the north of Hangar X2. It appears now that SpaceX is attempting to have as much of the Starship launchpad hardware being assembled kept together in one common area to help streamline construction. If we now take a look at that area, SpaceX seems to have turned that into extra parking spots for the employees at the site. Not a surprise given the surge in the amount of cars that are parked at Roberts Road over the last year or so. One has to wonder if they plan to build a multi-story parking structure at some point in the future, just like they did at Starbase. Along the same lines of more parking space, you might remember back in the last flyover, we mentioned how SpaceX had built new assembly jig footings to assemble new Starship tower sections to the south of the old Starship tower construction area. The new tower sections spotted in this flyover are being built in that new area, while the old area has also been turned into temporary car parking, so once again, I think they probably need their own big garage here, especially once Starship production starts. There are going to be a lot more people. It's also worth noting that SpaceX is still only able to assemble sections for only one Starship tower at a time at this site, because there are only 9 assembly spots and each tower has 9 modules, just as I mentioned earlier. By the way, in our previous flyover to the north of Hangar X2, SpaceX also had the ship quick disconnect arm for the Starship tower at LC-39A, but in order to make way for the temporary car parking, it's been moved inside the tent where SpaceX is building the 39A launch mount. Teams had already begun working on modifying this arm back when our team flew last month, and despite the relocation, it seems like that work is still underway inside the tent. We can see that crews have completely stripped the arm of its cryogenic pipes and are working on modifying its internals to make it similar in design to the one that's being built for Starbase's second tower. This includes moving some of the hardware that would normally be at the tip of the arm closer to the shoulder and installing an internal platform for easier access to this hardware. In fact, the platform was already installed by the time our team flew by. Near the tent, we can also see 3 long tubes with a flat plate attached to the end of each of them that have a lot of openings. These are 3 of the 4 manifolds that will be installed on the launch mount that will be used to supply the top deck with water for cooling during launches. Taking a peek into the tent, it looks like 3 of the 4 sides of the launch mount don't have any manifolds installed, so the 4th one either is installed on the only side of the mount we can't see, or it hasn't even been delivered yet to Roberts Road. Moving up north to the Roberts Road Northern expansion, work is continuing at pace on the foundations for the future Florida Giga Bay. We can see a good chunk of the foundation excavation has been filled with concrete, and teams have already started construction of the elevator shafts that will be used to bring employees and equipment up to the different levels of the bay. Right now, we can spot at least 8 of these future elevator shafts, with 4 being built to the south of the building and the other 4 to the north. Now, I'll hand it over to Adrian with the latest on Blue Origin's path to New Glenn's next launch.
At Blue Origin's exploration parks, things keep moving along for New Glenn and the company's lunar ambitions. Since our last flyover, the site has seen some very visible changes and a few behind-the-scenes steps that are just as exciting. Over at Lunar Plant 1, the building now proudly wears the Blue Origin feather logo across its exterior. When we last saw it, the structure was already looking close to finish, but now it feels like it's truly stepping into its role as the home for Blue's lunar manufacturing efforts. We suspect the interior will take a while longer to finish, as it will likely include things such as state-of-the-art clean rooms and specialized tooling. And speaking of lunar hardware, Blue Origin's CEO Dave Lim gave us a closer look at progress on the Blue Moon Mk1 lander. In his X post, he shared a photo of the mid-module with its spray-on foam insulation applied, writing, "Step by step, our journey to the moon later this year continues. Here's a cool pic from our surface coating facility, where the team applied spray-on foam insulation, or SOFI, to our Blue Moon Mk1 lunar lander mid-module. This insulation controls cryogenic heat leaking while in the atmosphere." That's a nice little peek at the care going into this vehicle, and it's a reminder that while the first 2 Mk1 landers are being built elsewhere, future ones will roll right out of this facility in Florida. When that time comes, having production just a short drive from the pad will be a big advantage, especially for the much larger Mk2 crewed lander under NASA's Artemis program. Transporting such a giant lander would be quite a challenge, so just as things on the Starship side, Blue choose to build up production capacity at the Cape to avoid long transport chains. On the New Glenn side of the campus, one of the more eye-catching moments from this flyover was the NG2 aft module on the move toward the pad for testing. If this follows the footsteps of the previous aft module, the section will be sea landing leg deployment tests. That's a clear sign that Flight 2 hardware is pushing deeper into its checkout flow. Sitting outside in another area was a forward module simulator that was used earlier on for handling practices. I guess they no longer need that, as they have the real deal now to work with, which is probably why it's out in the open. Meanwhile, there's a lot of groundwork activity that point to the next big wave of infrastructure. Blue appears to be preparing for an expansion of its composite manufacturing building, with visible site preparation and early foundation work on the way. This is the part of the New Glenn production facility where Blue builds the large 7-meter wide fairing halves of the rocket, so this expansion might mean Blue expects to fly New Glenn more often, or they're perhaps thinking of building other composite structures. Close by, crews are also getting started on the new hardware integration facility, which will eventually serve as a major hub for assembling New Glenn hardware before it moves to the launch pad. This is even earlier in the building process, as it's mostly a dirt patch so far, where excavators are smoothing and readying the area before any foundation and pile work can be done, but it's certainly also moving ahead at this point. The metal forming facility, which we talked about in our last update, is also pressing ahead. More framing has gone up, and it almost looks like most of the main segment is completed at this point. It's still very early in the build, but the footprint alone hints at just how much capability Blue is adding here. Taken together, the picture at Exploration Park is one of a company building not just rockets, but the ecosystem to produce them at scale, and do it right next to where they'll launch. That makes it the perfect time to check in on the other half of that equation. So let's leave the factory floor behind for a moment and head over to Launch Complex 36 to see what's happening at New Glenn's launch pad. At LC-36, Blue is not only preparing for New Glenn's next launch, but also for future flights as well. Last month, Dave Lim posted about forward module testing for New Glenn's second flight taking place at the pad. In his X post, he explained that this forward module testing consists of activating the reaction control system thrusters of New Glenn. Those help reorientate the booster in space for re-entry and help it guide itself for landing on Blue's drone ship. He mentioned that, quote, the GS1 RCS provides 20,000 pounds of thrust in any direction. To give you an idea, a single G18 Super Hornet F414 engine provides a similar amount of thrust at 22,000 pounds of thrust. While he compared it to a jet aircraft, we can do better and also compare it to other rocket engines. 20,000 pounds of thrust would be about 84% the thrust of an RL-10 engine, and is also the equivalent to the thrust of about 3.5 of Rocket Lab's Rutherford engines. It already tells you how big New Glenn is when just simply attitude control thrusters have a thrust similar to that of large upper stage engines or that of multiple small set rocket engines combined. It's not often that we get that much detail on what's being tested, and it's a reminder that New Glenn's recovery system isn't just about giant fins. It's packing a serious set of thrusters to make sure it comes back exactly where it's supposed to. As mentioned earlier, the aft module for NG2 also rolled out to the pad, so that will be another piece of hardware to be tested ahead of that launch. At LC-36, our team also spotted the New Glenn simulator out at the top of the ramp, likely being used to rehearse operations ahead of the real thing. The question is when that next flight will happen. During the launch campaign for New Glenn's first flight, the aft and forward module testing also happened in the July-August timeframe, and the flight ended up happening in January. So if they were to go at the same speed, it wouldn't bode well for a launch this year. But here's hoping they can go faster this time around. But what do you think? Do you think this time Blue will be able to do it faster, or will it take about the same time? Let us know in the comments below. In recent months, while all the other work has been ongoing, the company has installed a new flare stack at LC-36, but this one is not for New Glenn. Blue is using part of the north of the complex as a test site for its Blue Moon lander and has been working diligently to hook up the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen storage tanks at LC-36 to this test site. Since hydrogen is highly flammable, it is not vented and it is instead reclaimed and burned off safely at a flare stack located far away from the vehicle, and that's what they built at this location. The current setup at LC-36 is quite unique in the fact that it already has two hydrogen flare stacks, one for the tank farm boil-off and another one for New Glenn's own boil-off. An additional pair of methane flare stacks are also present at the site, which also corresponds to one for tank farm boil-off and another for New Glenn boil-off. Blue Moon landers, however, do not use liquid methane, so this site does not need an additional flare stack for that fuel, just for hydrogen. With both flight hardware and new pad systems coming online, LC-36 is steadily moving from a construction site and into an operational launch complex. Hopefully it won't be long before New Glenn hardware starts making regular appearances here, and eventually its second flight lights up this pad for the first time since NG1. I will now hand it over back to Ryan with the latest on the activities taking place at SpaceX Launch Complex on the Space Coasts.
SpaceX has been quite busy at its launch pad since our last flyover, and it's not just because they launch a lot. They're also doing loads of construction work, especially at Launch Complex 39A. The company is continuing to make great progress on the Starship launch pad at this historic site. Over the last month, teams have begun delivering dozens of flame trench wall sections to the complex, which have been staged nearby ahead of installation. These will eventually be stacked on top of each other, welded together, and then filled up with concrete, thus creating the super reinforced walls of the flame trench that the launch mount will sit on, and also used to assist with properly directing the engine exhaust plumes in the correct direction during launches. Since we can't fly directly over the pad with the restricted airspace, we can help ourselves with this satellite shot acquired by our friend Harry Stranger from Planet just a few days ago. We can see from both this satellite picture and our flyover shots that the flame trench is still being populated with rebar and is yet to have its concrete floors poured. And before you mention the fact that concrete can be seen in the flame trench, that's just the blinding layer that sits under the concrete floors. SpaceX also recently delivered the two halves of the flame bucket to the launch site, and we can see them staged next to the Vulcan horizontal integration facility. Teams have also delivered 4 of the 5 A-shaped frames that the flame bucket halves and ridge will rest on once they're lowered into the flame trench. We've of course seen all of this already at Starbase's Pad 2, so that archive is essentially a step-by-step guide detailing exactly what the next few weeks have to offer at 39A. SpaceX has also made great progress on the deluge tank farm, with more of the green water pipes being staged in the trench that's been excavated for them. We can see from our flyover shots the sheet piles that have been driven down into the ground to reinforce the sides of the trench where these pipes are being placed. Teams are also making great progress to the north, where the propellant tank farm for Starship will be located. There is now significantly more rebar in place in the locations where we expect the pumps and subcoolers for methane and oxygen to be installed. Interestingly, it looks like the GSE lines that will be running from this location will be staying above ground for a while before dipping underground, starting just behind the launch tower. We've mentioned a few times in previous Space Coast updates just how different the order of construction of different launch site items was at 39A compared to Starbase's second pad. One big example is the commodities trench for all of the fluids, power and data connections that go underground to reach the launch mount. At Starbase, this trench has been built at the same time as the flame trench, and at the same time a service structure had been built adjacent to the trench that would interface with the launch mount and provide all of those commodities. Well, all of that hardware is only just now being put together at LC-39A. Both from the satellite shots and our own flyover pictures, we can see that teams have begun constructing the underground portion of the commodities trench that will go out to the launch mount. We've also spotted in our flyover pictures several trucks with parts for the service structure, and those parts are in fact still being delivered as seen via our cameras available 24/7 on Space Coast Live. Apart from that hardware, we've also seen the delivery of several other pieces of equipment, such as tank farm support hardware, which has been staged to the southwest of the complex. Near this location, there's also been some interesting groundwork and structures being built. This could be the location where SpaceX may have some of the planned facilities for LC-39A, such as the natural gas purification plant, methane liquefier, and the air separation unit. All of these are explained in detail in the draft environmental impact statement that was released a few weeks ago by the FAA. We have an entire video hosted by yours truly detailing all of the planned things for Starship at 39A and their impact, so I highly recommend you watch that in order to understand a little bit of what we're explaining in this Space Coast update. Coming back to that work I mentioned a moment ago, we can see that over the last couple of flyovers, a new structure is being built just to the west of the fixed service structure at 39A. Alongside it are also several stacks of high-pressure cylinders and a few cryogenic tanks. This setup looks a lot like the one we've seen being used at the Sanchez lot at Starbase for the natural gas generator building, which, until recently, provided power to the site. While this specific building does not appear in the draft EIS, there is the mention of a set of Tesla megapacks that will be installed at 39A to store electricity to power all of the other new facilities. It seems as if crews have also prepared the ground for installation of these megapacks a bit further west of the complex. Given the tight space on the east side of 39A, it wouldn't be surprising if SpaceX also ends up building the natural gas purification plant, the methane liquefier, and the air separation unit on the west side of the complex. These aren't small facilities, so they will require as much space as possible. One big piece of hardware missing at LC-39A though is the large crane, or cranes, that will be required at some point in the near future to lift the huge Starship launch mount and, much later down the line, install the ship quick disconnect arm on the launch tower. We'll keep our eyes peeled for that, as always. SpaceX is also continuing to make great progress not just at 39A but also at Slick 37, where teams are working to clear the area to prepare it for future construction of Starship ground infrastructure. Right now, it's too early to say when that build-up might begin, but one thing is for certain. Once it begins, it will likely be just as fast as what we've seen at Starbase and at LC-39A. But now, I'll hand it back over to Adrian with a bittersweet farewell and a lot more launchpad work elsewhere around the Cape.
Just a few weeks ago, we bid goodbye to SpaceX Landing Zone 1. The booster landing as part of the Crew 11 mission earlier this month was the last one planned for the site, as SpaceX lease for the site runs out. Instead, two new companies, Vaya Space and Phantom Space, will be using the site, which is formerly known as Launch Complex 13. While the companies prepare to set up shop at the site, SpaceX will continue to use the other landing site, Landing Zone 2, for the near future. Vaya Space is currently undergoing environmental approvals to commence groundwork at the site, while working in parallel with SpaceX to coordinate the transition of the pad from landing site to a launch site. Now, this doesn't mean SpaceX will no longer return their boosters back to the Cape. Instead, SpaceX will be building landing pads at LZ-39A and Slick 40 that will substitute LZ-1 and LZ-2. The use of LZ-2 is likely an interim thing while environmental approvals come by for the construction of the new landing zones at 39A and 40. Moving north from Launch Complex 13 is Launch Complex 14, the launch site for Stoke's Nova rocket. The company is quickly going through the launch site build-up process and has already started building the 4 lightning protection towers for the launch complex. These 4 towers will hold up the catenary wires that will form a sort of Faraday cage that will protect the rocket from lightning. Although I guess there are 5 towers rather than 4. The one right in the center will be the umbilical tower used for Nova, which will provide the rocket with the fluids, power and data connections until right before liftoff. Stoke also recently posted a blog on its website detailing some of the launch pad work, including the build-up of the launch mount for Nova, which is getting ready for a big pouring of concrete. The company also continues to make further progress on the tank farm systems and says its integration hangar will be enclosed by the end of September. Stoke is also making great progress at their own facilities in Washington state to build, test and ready the first Nova rocket to launch from this site. In just less than a year, LC-14 has gone from an old launch pad to a 21st century launch complex. Moving up north to Launch Complex 16 is the launch site for Relativity's Space Terran R rocket. Since our last flyover, Relativity has made a lot more progress on the giant hangar that will in the future host Terran R rocket integration and launch preparations. Further north, we can also see the company has started building the giant water tank that will be used for deluge and sound suppression at the launch site. Just like Stoke, Relativity is also making great progress at their own build and test facilities to bring the first flight hardware of Terran R to the Space Coast. The company has continued building up flight hardware and has completed qualification testing of the Aeron R engine that will power the rocket's first stage. It's just a matter of time until Terran R hardware starts appearing in Florida. Over at Space Launch Complex 41, we can see United Launch Alliance's Vulcan rocket getting ready for its 3rd launch, which has happened at this point. The mission, named USSF 106, is Vulcan's first flight for the US Department of Defense after having been certified for these flights earlier in the year. This will also be the first flight of Vulcan equipped with 4 solid rocket motors as opposed to 2 like on the first 2 flights. With 2 BE-4 engines plus the 4 GEM 63XL solid rocket motors, this Vulcan will be the most powerful rocket ever launched by ULA, with a thrust higher than the Atlas V and its 5 SRB configuration. South of Slick 41 is also ULA's with A, which stands for Vertical Assembly Facility Amazon. That's right, this is where the Kuiper Vulcan missions will be integrated and prepared for flight. The building will allow ULA to process 2 Vulcan rockets in parallel, one at the original VIF and another one here, which can translate into a higher launch cadence. ULA is nearing completion of the VIF-A and aims to process the first Kuiper Vulcan mission later this year. Going now to the Mobile Launcher Park side, we can see further progress on the Mobile Launcher 2 for NASA's SLS rocket. Since our last flyover, teams at Beil have continued outfitting the Mobile Launcher platform and umbilical tower with more hardware. We can see 2 new umbilicals have been added to the tower. These will attach to the exploration upper stage of the SLS Block 1B once it's on the mobile launcher. Down on the ground, next to the structure, we can see the hoods for one of the tail service mast umbilicals that will supply propellant and other fluids to the SLS core stage. While that may not happen for a few years, work continues on readying the SLS rocket and hardware for the very next flight, Artemis II, which will be the first crewed flight around the moon in more than 50 years. Over the last 3 months, the Exploration Grounds Systems team at NASA have been working on fueling and loading commodities into the European service module for the Orion spacecraft that will be flown on Artemis II. Near the end of this process, the crew of Artemis II, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen, were able to get up and close with the spacecraft they will be riding to the moon. The crew got to perform a crew equipment interface test of Orion, which is NASA's technical lingo for getting into their spacesuit and going inside the capsule and getting familiarized with it. Since then, Orion has been moved from the multi-payload processing facility out to the Launch Abort System facility to get its Launch Abort System installed. Once that's complete, Orion will be ready to be stacked on top of the SLS, which sits inside the VAB ready to accept the spacecraft.
Well, there you have it. Starship Progress is marching forward. Blue Origin is pressing for a second flight of New Glenn, and we could be just 6 months away from Artemis II. It's an exciting time on the Space Coast. I've been Ryan Caton for NSF. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.